Welcome. You are settling now into a place of quietness, far from the noise of your day. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Feel the weight of your body sinking into whatever holds you. There is nowhere you need to be but here, in this moment, listening. Tonight, we are stepping back across more than 2,000 years. We are walking into the ancient Levant, that crescent of land where the Mediterranean sun beats down on stone and olive groves, where water is precious and the earth remembers 10,000 human stories. We are entering the world of ancient Israel, a small nation caught between empires, shaped by prophets, driven by kings, and sustained by a faith that would reshape the entire world. Imagine it as a warm evening in the hills of Judea. The sun has just touched the western horizon, turning the limestone cliffs the color of honey and old gold. In the valleys below, small villages are settling into night. Smoke rises from cooking fires, children are being called in from the dust, and in this quiet moment, before sleep comes, the people of this land are thinking about their past, the stories their grandmothers told them, the songs their fathers sang, the struggles their ancestors endured. As you listen, let yourself become part of this world. Feel the warmth of the Mediterranean sun on your skin. Hear the bleating of goats in distant hills. Smell the dust and the olive oil and the incense in the temple. Let your mind drift into this landscape and let the stories settle into you like shadows lengthening at the end of the day. We begin now with a land and a people and the long story of who they were and what they built. The land that would become Israel and Judah is not large. You could walk it in a month from north to south. It lies on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea, squeezed between the vast waters and the great desert to the east. This is the Levant, the land where Europe, Africa, and Asia have always looked toward each other. It is a place of passage, a corridor between continents, and because of this, it would never belong entirely to itself. The geography tells the story before any king or prophet ever speaks. The land rises in a series of terraces. Along the coast, a thin strip of fertile soil borders the sea, good for fishing, good for trade, but always vulnerable to those who could master the waves. Moving inland, the ground climbs. Mountains run north to south like the backbone of a sleeping animal. The western slopes receive moisture from Mediterranean storms. The eastern slopes fall away into dryness and then true desert. In the north lies the fertile crescent of Galilee, where springs run year-round and the earth is kind to those who work it. In the center and south, the hills are rockier, the water more precious, the life of the land more precarious. And at the very bottom, where the land drops away into a great valley, lies the Dead Sea, the lowest body of water on earth, salty and heavy, bordered by cliffs and desolation. This is difficult land. It does not surrender its bounty easily. The people who lived here had to be resourceful, had to know where water could be found, had to understand the seasons with an intimacy that came only from generations of paying attention. They terraced hillsides to prevent erosion and to capture every drop of rain. They dug cisterns to store water during the dry months. They moved with their herds, followed the patterns of the sun, lived in rhythm with earth and sky. Now, history is often taught as if it begins with the written record, with inscriptions on stone and papyrus that can be read and counted and verified. But the story of the people who would become Israel begins long before that. Archaeological evidence suggests that people who worshipped a god called Yahweh, or a variation of that name, were living in the central hills of Canaan from at least the 13th century before Christ. They were not alone in this land. Canaan, this was the ancient name for the region, was home to many peoples. There were Canaanites who had lived here since before memory, with their own gods and their own ways. There were Phoenicians along the coast, master sailors and traders. There were Philistines to the south, people who had come from the Aegean and settled into the coastal plains. And then, gradually moving into the hills, came groups of people called Hebrews or Israelites, people with a god of their own, a faith unlike the polytheism of their neighbors. The earliest historical mention of Israel outside the Bible appears on a stone monument erected by the Egyptian pharaoh Merneptah around 1207 BCE. In his record of a military campaign, he mentions Israel as a defeated people he had vanquished. This is the first written confirmation that a group called Israel existed. Before this, there are hints and shadows, stories passed down, memories woven into narrative. But from this moment, Israel enters the documentary record of the ancient world. What we know from the archaeological records suggests something quite different from what later religious tradition would claim. The people who would become the Israelites were not a sudden invasion from the desert. They did not arrive as a unified force under a single leader. Instead, they emerged gradually, settling in the hills, distinguishing themselves from their neighbors not by conquest but by cultural and religious identity. Over generations, they developed a unique relationship with their God, a God who was not simply one among many, but unique, with a special covenant with them. The word covenant is important. It means a binding agreement, a promise sealed between two parties. The Israelites came to understand their relationship with their God, Yahweh, as a covenant, a deal struck not by chance, but by design. Yahweh would be their God. They would be his people. He would protect them. They would follow his law. This idea, which seems simple to us now, was revolutionary in the ancient world. It meant that their God was not capricious like the gods of their neighbors, not demanding human sacrifice or endless offerings. Instead, Yahweh demanded justice, demanded righteousness, demanded that his people treat each other with dignity and fairness. In the traditional telling, the story as recorded in the Hebrew Bible, Israel's origins lie even further back. They trace their ancestry to a man called Abraham, who lived in the land of Ur in ancient Mesopotamia, and to whom God made a promise: "Your descendants will be as numerous as the stars, and I will give them this land." This is the theological foundation of Israel's claim to the land they inhabited. Whether Abraham was a historical figure or a symbolic ancestor is a question scholars still debate. But what is clear is that the people of ancient Israel understood themselves as having a deep, covenantal right to the land they lived in. And so, as we approach the historical period, the time when kings begin to rule and prophets begin to speak, we must understand the foundation upon which everything is built. A people who understood themselves as chosen, as having received a sacred promise, as owing their existence to a God who spoke to them and demanded from them righteousness and justice. This understanding would shape everything that followed. It would inspire great acts of faith and terrible acts of violence. It would comfort people in despair and sustain them through exile. And it would ultimately transform not just Israel and Judah, but the entire world. For several centuries, the people of Israel lived without a king. They were organized into tribes, each with its own territory, its own leadership, its own concerns. They gathered periodically at sacred places to worship together, to coordinate their defense against common enemies, to remember that they shared something beyond mere geography. They shared a God and a covenant. This system worked reasonably well during peaceful times, but by the 11th century before Christ, a crisis was emerging. To the west, the Philistines, that technologically advanced people who had mastered ironworking, were pushing inland from their coastal settlements. They were militarily superior to the scattered Israelite tribes, and the tribes found themselves unable to mount a unified defense against this threat. Over time, the Philistines began to dominate Israelite territory, extracting tribute, controlling the heights, establishing a kind of colonial rule. And so, around 1020 BCE, the people chose their first king. His name was Saul, and he came from the tribe of Benjamin, from a family of some wealth but no royal lineage. The prophet Samuel, who held great authority in Israel, anointed him with oil, a gesture that signified that Yahweh had chosen him to rule. Saul was, by all accounts, a warrior of exceptional courage and strength. He was tall, commanding, the kind of man other men wanted to follow into battle. Saul's reign lasted perhaps 30 years, from roughly 1020 to 1000 BCE. And during that time, he achieved what the isolated tribes had been unable to accomplish. He pushed back the Philistines. He organized Israel's military, he won victories, he created something that resembled a unified state. But Saul's reign was always troubled. He was haunted by internal doubts, by the weight of leadership, by a sense that he was not truly favored by Yahweh. The biblical accounts describe him as subject to dark moods, to paranoia, to periods of deep despair. That other was David, and David would become the figure around whom an entire mythology would grow. A shepherd boy who defeated a giant, a warrior king who expanded Israel to its greatest territorial extent, a poet and a musician, a man of extraordinary charisma and strategic brilliance, and yet also a man of profound moral failing. David is perhaps the most important figure in the history of ancient Israel, and to understand Israel itself, one must understand him. David was born in Bethlehem, a small town in the hills of Judah. He was the youngest of 8 sons born to a man named Jesse. The biblical account describes him as handsome, with a ruddy complexion and fair hair, but what mattered more than his appearance was his character. He could play music, the harp, with a skill that seemed to touch the soul, and he possessed that particular gift of confidence that great leaders seem to have, a kind of certainty that whatever he attempted would succeed. When David was still a young man, his greatest moment came. The Philistines and the Israelites were facing each other in a valley, ready for battle, but neither side quite willing to commit to the horror of a full engagement. And then the Philistines sent forward a champion to challenge the Israelites to single combat. His name was Goliath, and he was enormous, over 9 feet tall. The biblical account says, though archaeologists suggest that's probably an exaggeration. He was encased in armor, he carried a spear as thick as a weaver's beam, and he issued a challenge. Let one of you come forward and fight me. The winner's people will win the war, the loser's people will become slaves. This is the moment where myth and history become difficult to separate. What we know for certain is that there was a famous victory by Israel over Goliath, and that David was associated with it. The biblical narrative describes David, this young shepherd with no military training, requesting permission from King Saul to fight the giant. Saul offers him armor, but David refuses it. Instead, he takes his shepherd's sling, selects 5 smooth stones from a brook, and walks out to meet Goliath. The encounter itself, as described, takes only moments. Goliath, slow and heavy in his armor, expects a man also armed and armored. Instead, he faces a lightly moving young man with a sling. David fires 1 stone. It strikes Goliath in the forehead, stunning him. He falls. David rushes forward, takes Goliath's own sword, and kills him with it. Whether it happened exactly this way, we cannot know. But what is important is what this story meant to Israel, and what it meant to David's rise. Here was a young man of humble birth, unarmored and seemingly outmatched, who defeated the champion of the enemy through faith, courage, and skill. From that moment forward, David became a hero. The women of Israel sang about him. Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands, they sang. And King Saul, hearing this, understood that his throne was already being given away. The relationship between Saul and David is one of the most complex and human stories in ancient literature. Saul loved David. He made him a commander of his armies, and David served him loyally and effectively. But Saul also feared David. He could see in the young man the future of Israel, the king that Yahweh had chosen in his place. And so love and fear intertwined. Saul attempted to have David killed. David fled, hiding in caves and wastelands, gathering around him a band of loyal followers, outlaws and rebels who lived on the margins of Saul's kingdom. For years, David lived as a fugitive, a man without a home, hunted by the king he had served so faithfully. There are stories from this period that show David's character, moments where he could have killed Saul in his sleep, but refused to do so, not wanting to raise his hand against Yahweh's anointed. Whether these stories are historically accurate or have been embellished is impossible to say. What matters is that they reveal something essential about how Israel understood David. As a man of profound moral sensitivity, capable of restraint even toward his enemy. The end of Saul's reign came not at David's hand, but at the hand of the Philistines. In a final battle on Mount Gilboa, the Philistines defeated Saul's forces. Saul, rather than be captured, fell on his own sword. His sons, including his heir, were also killed in the battle. Israel's first king died not in his bed, surrounded by courtiers, but on a battlefield, his dynasty dying with him. David, now in his 30s, moved quickly to consolidate power. He was anointed king over Judah, the southern kingdom, and ruled from the city of Hebron. For 7 years he shared power uneasily with Ishbosheth, Saul's surviving son, who was nominally king of the northern tribes. But gradually, through alliance building and the elimination of rivals, David extended his authority over the entire land. By approximately 1000 BCE, David was the undisputed king of a unified Israel. What David inherited was a kingdom in pieces, economically weakened, militarily threatened, spiritually uncertain. What he would build, through the force of his personality and his military genius, was something unprecedented. A regional power that could stand against the great empires of the age. He conquered Jerusalem, a city that had been held by a people called the Jebusites, and made it his capital. It was a brilliant choice, a neutral territory between north and south, a place where ancient memory and new ambition could meet. David's reign, which lasted approximately 40 years, was a time of expansion and consolidation. He defeated the Philistines decisively, pushing them back to their coastal enclaves. He conquered territory to the north, south, and east, creating an empire that stretched from the Euphrates River to the Negev Desert, from the Mediterranean to the edges of the Arabian Plateau. Israel under David became a power that other nations had to reckon with. But like all human beings, David was not perfect. In the middle of his reign came a moment of profound moral failure. While his army was away at war, David saw from his roof a woman bathing. Her name was Bathsheba, and she was beautiful. He wanted her. He sent for her, lay with her, and she became pregnant. To cover his sin, David arranged for her husband, a loyal soldier named Uriah, to be placed in the front lines of battle, where he was killed. This is not a moment that the biblical tradition glosses over or minimizes. Instead, it is told starkly, the ugliness of royal power exposed. David, the man favored by Yahweh, had become guilty of adultery and murder. And when the prophet Nathan confronted him about what he had done, David, to his great credit, did not deny it, did not rationalize it, did not blame others. He acknowledged his sin completely. "I have sinned against Yahweh," he said. This moment, this confession, this taking of complete responsibility, became part of what made David beloved to Israel. Even in his greatest failure, he showed a capacity for truth and repentance. The child born to David and Bathsheba died in infancy, understood as Yahweh's judgment. But they would have another son, Solomon, and it is this son who would become David's heir and the next king of Israel. David's reign ended around 960 BCE when he was in his 70s. His body, worn by decades of warfare and passion, was finally failing him. He sat in his house, aware of his coming death, and named Solomon, his youngest surviving son, as his heir. This was not automatic. Succession was never automatic in the ancient world. The king had to be accepted by the people and the priesthood. But David's choice was honored, and Solomon became king. Solomon's reign, which would last approximately 40 years, roughly 960 to 930 BCE, stands in striking contrast to his father's. Where David had been a warrior, constantly expanding his territory, constantly at war, Solomon was an administrator, an organizer, a builder. He would not expand the kingdom much beyond what David had left him, but he would systematize it, making it run with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. He would also, through a combination of diplomatic skill and commercial acumen, make it wealthier than it had ever been. When Solomon ascended to the throne, Israel was already a powerful kingdom, but it was also a loose collection of territories and peoples, not fully integrated into a single political unit. Solomon's first task was to consolidate control. He reorganized the kingdom administratively, dividing it into 12 districts, each ruled by an official responsible for collecting taxes and organizing labor. He created a standing army, unprecedented in Israel until this point, with chariotry, cavalry, and infantry. He began a program of fortification, building military strongholds throughout his kingdom. But the great achievement for which Solomon is remembered is not military but architectural. He resolved to build a temple in Jerusalem, a permanent house for Yahweh, a place more magnificent and more permanent than the mobile tabernacle that had held the Ark of the Covenant through the wilderness years. This was an audacious project. Temples in the ancient world were enormous undertakings, requiring vast resources, skilled workers, and sustained commitment over many years. Solomon's temple, often called the First Temple to distinguish it from a later temple that would be built after exile, was, by ancient standards, an impressive structure. It was not enormous by the standards of the great temples of Egypt or Mesopotamia, but it was exquisitely decorated and symbolically crucial. The building itself was made of stone, constructed on the high place that would later be called the Temple Mount in the city of Jerusalem. Inside the sanctuary, the space was divided into areas of increasing sanctity, culminating in the Holy of Holies, the innermost chamber where the Ark of the Covenant was placed. The walls were decorated with carvings, cherubim, palm trees, open flowers. The doors were made of olive wood, overlaid with gold. The vessels used in worship were made of bronze and silver and gold. Incense rose constantly from the altar, and priests, organized into a complex hierarchy, performed the sacrifices and rituals that constituted Israel's formal worship of Yahweh. Building the temple required an enormous investment of resources. Solomon sent his envoys to Phoenicia, to the king of Tyre, to arrange for cedar wood, the finest building material available. He organized labor on a massive scale. Scholars estimate that it took 7 years to build, and required workers numbering in the tens of thousands. Some of these workers were Israelites, conscripted for service. Others were captured people from territories conquered by David, who were compelled to work. The system was efficient, but it was also oppressive. Solomon was different from David in another way as well. While David had had multiple wives, this was common for ancient kings. Solomon seems to have taken this practice to an extreme. The biblical tradition claims he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. This is undoubtedly exaggerated, but it reflects the historical reality that Solomon married women from many different nations and cultures, using these marriages to forge diplomatic alliances and trade relationships. His household was enormous, glittering with foreign luxuries, representing the cosmopolitan sophistication of a kingdom at the height of its power. For all his sophistication, Solomon made decisions that suggest a man somewhat out of touch with the common people he ruled. He created an administrative system that was efficient but also extractive. The people's resources flowed constantly toward the royal center. He built a palace for himself that was even larger and more elaborate than the temple of Yahweh, suggesting where his true priorities lay. He entered into trade agreements that benefited the royal treasury, but not necessarily the common people. Solomon's famous wisdom, his legendary ability to judge cases and solve problems, is celebrated in the biblical tradition. The most famous story involves two women claiming the same baby. Solomon proposed cutting the child in half, giving half to each mother. The true mother, horrified at this prospect, renounced her claim to save the child's life. Through this test, Solomon identified who the real mother was. Whether this story is historical fact or parable does not really matter. What matters is that it captured something important. Solomon was understood as a man who saw into hearts, who understood human motivation, who could cut through appearance to get at truth. Solomon's reign lasted 40 years. When he died around 920 BCE, he left his son Rehoboam with a kingdom that was powerful and wealthy, but that was also deeply fractured, with the common people burdened by taxation and labor service, with the religious establishment concerned about the dilution of Yahweh's worship, and with ambitious men in the northern regions beginning to wonder whether their loyalty to a Jerusalem-based monarchy truly served their interests. When Rehoboam, Solomon's son, came to the throne around 920 BCE, his first action was to go to Shechem, in the northern territories, to be officially recognized as king by the northern tribes. Shechem held symbolic importance. It was a place of ancient covenants, a sacred site. The people gathered to welcome their new king, but they came with a request. They had borne a heavy burden under Solomon, they said. They asked that Rehoboam lighten the tax burden and the labor conscription that had weighed on them. Rehoboam consulted with the elders who had served his father, wise men who counseled moderation, who advised him to accede to the people's request, to show himself generous and understanding. But he also consulted with young men of his own age, his companions, who counseled the opposite. They told him that any show of weakness would be interpreted as inability to rule. They urged him to respond with harshness, to assert his authority absolutely. Rehoboam chose the path of arrogance. He told the people that if they had found Solomon's yoke heavy, his would be heavier still. His little finger, he said, was thicker than his father's loins, a crude, insulting way of asserting dominance. The northern tribes, hearing this response, rose in rebellion. They rejected Rehoboam and chose one of their own, a man named Jeroboam, as their king. And from that moment, the kingdom that David had unified and Solomon had maintained split into two separate nations. The northern kingdom became known as Israel, with its capital eventually established in the city of Samaria. It contained 10 of the 12 tribes and was always the more populous and economically productive of the two kingdoms. It had access to more trade routes, better agricultural land in some areas, and more aggressive neighbors that forced it to develop stronger military capabilities. The southern kingdom became known as Judah, with its capital in Jerusalem. It contained two tribes, Judah and Benjamin, and held the temple, which gave it a spiritual prestige that the north could never fully match. But Judah was smaller, poorer, more isolated. Its kings would be the descendants of David, which gave them a kind of religious legitimacy. But politically and militarily, they would always be the weaker of the two kingdoms. The split was not immediate or total. There were moments in the following centuries when the two kingdoms cooperated, when they recognized each other's existence, when they even fought alongside each other against common enemies. But they were fundamentally different in character. The northern kingdom, Israel, was always more cosmopolitan, more engaged with the surrounding world, more open to foreign trade and culture. The southern kingdom, Judah, was more conservative, more inward-looking, more devoted to the temple cult and the traditions associated with David and Yahweh's covenant with his people. In the early years after the split, both kingdoms struggled. They fought with each other constantly. They were harassed by their neighbors, Arameans to the north and east, Philistines to the west, Edomites to the south. The glory days of David's empire quickly faded. Israel and Judah, taken separately, were no match for the great powers that surrounded them. But in the 8th century before Christ, something remarkable happened. The northern kingdom of Israel, under a series of kings in the Omri dynasty, achieved a new period of power and prosperity. These kings, Omri and his son Ahab and Ahab's successors, built a strong military, developed trade networks, and created a state that was once again a significant player in the politics of the eastern Mediterranean. The reign of Ahab, who ruled from approximately 869 to 850 BCE, was particularly significant. Ahab was an effective military commander and an astute political operator. He formed alliances with neighboring kingdoms, sometimes attacking them, sometimes cooperating with them as circumstances demanded. He expanded Israel's territory and brought the kingdom a period of economic prosperity. But Ahab's reign is remembered primarily for his religious policies and the opposition he faced from Israel's prophetic tradition. Ahab married a Phoenician princess named Jezebel, and under her influence, he promoted the worship of Baal, a foreign god, the fertility god worshipped throughout the Levant. In the eyes of Israel's religious establishment, this was a catastrophic betrayal, a violation of the covenant between Israel and Yahweh. It was during this period that we encounter one of Israel's most famous prophets, Elijah. Elijah appears in the biblical text as an austere, uncompromising figure, living in the wilderness, appearing suddenly in the cities to confront kings and priests. He wore hair garments, drank only water, ate only what he could find in the wild. He represented the old Israel, the Israel of the desert and the covenant, in confrontation with the new Israel, the Israel of cities and alliances and foreign gods. The struggle between Elijah and Ahab, as portrayed in the biblical text, is a struggle between two visions of what Israel should be. Ahab wanted a kingdom that was open to the world, that adopted the practices and the gods of neighboring peoples, that participated fully in the cultural and religious world of the eastern Mediterranean. Elijah wanted Israel to remain separate, to maintain its covenant with Yahweh, to reject foreign gods and foreign practices. The conflict came to a head in a famous episode described in the biblical tradition. Ahab's territory was suffering from a severe drought, 3.5 years without rain. In the ancient world, such a drought meant famine, meant death. Ahab blamed Elijah for the drought, believing that Elijah's God, Yahweh, was punishing Israel for its abandonment of his worship. Elijah agreed that the drought was punishment for Israel's apostasy, but he proposed a test to determine which God was real and worthy of worship. On Mount Carmel, a high place overlooking the Mediterranean coast, Elijah challenged the 450 priests of Baal to a contest. "Prepare a sacrifice," Elijah said. "Lay it on an altar, but do not light a fire. Call on your God to consume the sacrifice with fire from heaven. Then I will do the same with Yahweh. Whichever God answers is the true God." The priests of Baal, according to the biblical account, called and prayed all through the morning and into the afternoon, but nothing happened. Their God did not answer. The sacrifice lay unburned on the altar. Then Elijah prepared his sacrifice and had water poured on it to make it even more clearly impossible for fire to consume it. Then he called out a simple prayer: "Yahweh, answer me, that this people may know that you are God and that you have turned their hearts back." And fire fell from heaven and consumed the sacrifice. The people, seeing this, cried out, "Yahweh, He is God! Yahweh, He is God!" Whether this happened exactly as described is impossible to verify, but the story captures something that was undoubtedly true. There was a profound spiritual struggle in Israel and Judah in the 9th and 8th centuries before Christ. One vision of what Israel should be, a cosmopolitan kingdom, open to foreign influence, syncretistic in its religion, was in conflict with another vision, a kingdom devoted exclusively to Yahweh, separate from foreign influence, maintaining the ancient covenant. This conflict would continue throughout the history of both kingdoms, and it would be one of the primary drivers of change and conflict in Israelite society. Ahab died in battle around 850 BCE, killed by an Aramean arrow. His dynasty continued for a few more generations, but his successors gradually lost power. By the end of the 9th century BCE, the northern kingdom of Israel was no longer the dominant power in the region. A new superpower was rising in the east, the Assyrian Empire, and it would eventually change everything. In the 8th century before Christ, the world of the eastern Mediterranean changed fundamentally with the rise of Assyria. The Assyrian Empire, based in Mesopotamia in what is now Iraq, was not new. Assyrian cities had existed for centuries. But in the 8th century, under a series of powerful kings, Assyria began a program of imperial expansion that would make it the dominant power in the entire eastern Mediterranean world. Assyrian military technology and tactics were unlike anything the smaller kingdoms of the Levant had yet encountered. The Assyrians had developed an organized standing army with different branches: infantry, cavalry, and chariotry. They had engineered sophisticated siege warfare techniques. They had weaponry made of iron, which was superior to the bronze and iron available to most of their enemies. But perhaps most importantly, they had an ideology of expansion backed by the will and resources of a great state. The Assyrian kings were not content to merely conquer territory. They had a system of imperial control that involved the forced relocation of populations. When they conquered a region, they would deport the local population to distant parts of the empire and import people from elsewhere, breaking the cultural and religious continuity of conquered peoples and making rebellion less likely. This was the threat that began to loom over Israel and Judah in the second half of the 8th century. The Assyrian Empire was expanding westward toward the Levant, toward Israel and Judah. The smaller kingdoms in the region had a choice: submit and pay tribute, or resist and be destroyed. The northern kingdom of Israel initially tried resistance. A series of kings in the early 8th century, particularly Jehu and his descendants, had maintained Israel's independence and strength. But as the Assyrian threat grew more serious, as Assyrian armies began to appear regularly on the borders of the Levant, Israel found itself facing an enemy it could not match in military strength. Around the year 740 BCE, an Assyrian king named Tiglath-Pileser III began a renewed campaign of expansion. His goal was nothing less than to bring all the territories of the eastern Mediterranean under Assyrian control. He defeated the Aramean kingdoms to the north and east, and then he turned his attention to Israel and Judah and other small nations in the Levant. Israel, under its kings, tried a combination of strategies. At times, they paid tribute to Assyria, hoping to appease the mighty power to the north. At times, they formed alliances with other small kingdoms, hoping that united, they might be stronger. But none of these strategies could work against an empire as powerful and as determined as Assyria. By the 720s BCE, the situation had become dire. Israel was under the rule of a king named Hoshea, and Hoshea made a fateful decision. He attempted to break free from Assyrian overlordship and form an alliance with Egypt, another great power, hoping that Egypt would help defend Israel against Assyria. The Assyrians could not tolerate such rebellion. An Assyrian king named Sargon II marched westward with his army. He laid siege to the capital of Israel, the city of Samaria, and after a siege lasting 3 years, the city fell. According to Assyrian records, Sargon deported 27,290 Israelites from the land to far-flung regions of the Assyrian Empire. The rest of the population, those who were not deported, was left behind, along with foreign peoples that Assyria brought in to settle the region. And with that, the northern kingdom of Israel ceased to exist as an independent nation. Never again would it govern itself. The 10 tribes that made up the northern kingdom, these became known as the 10 lost tribes in later Jewish tradition. Some probably assimilated into the cultures of the places they were deported to. Some probably eventually returned to the land, mixed with the foreign peoples that Assyria had brought in. But the kingdom, as a political entity, was gone. This was a catastrophe without parallel in Israel's history. A kingdom that had existed for 200 years, that had been a genuine power in the politics of the Eastern Mediterranean, that had produced prophets and warriors and wise men, was gone. Its territory was absorbed into the Assyrian Empire. Its people were scattered across the empire. Its religious establishments, the sanctuaries and priesthoods, were destroyed. Everything that the northern kingdom had been, its political independence, its cultural continuity, its religious institutions, was erased. What remained was only Judah. The southern kingdom, smaller and weaker, but also more conservative in its politics, had managed to survive. When Sargon conquered the north, the king of Judah was Ahaz. Rather than resist the Assyrians, Ahaz quickly submitted, paying tribute and accepting Assyrian overlordship. It was not a proud choice, but it was a practical one. Judah would survive where Israel had been destroyed. The fate of Israel was a tremendous blow to Jewish consciousness, a wound that would never entirely heal. The lost kingdom, the scattered people, the destroyed temples, these became part of the theological understanding of what it meant to be in exile, to be separated from one's land and one's God. Centuries later, when Judah itself would face exile, this earlier catastrophe would be remembered, and the 10 lost tribes would become objects of hope and speculation. Perhaps someday they would return. Perhaps they were still living somewhere beyond the known world, waiting for the day when they could come home. But for now, in the 8th century BCE, Judah stood alone. The kingdom was much smaller, much poorer. It was under the overlordship of Assyria and would remain so for roughly a century. But it had preserved something that Israel had lost: a sense of religious continuity, a dynasty that traced itself back to David, a capital city with a temple, a people with a collective memory of what it had been. This would prove to be sufficient for survival, and eventually for something more. With the northern kingdom destroyed, Judah became the sole inheritor of Israel's legacy. The kingdom was tiny, roughly 60 miles north to south, 30 miles east to west, a fragment of what the united Israel under David had been. But in this small territory, something significant was happening. Judah was entering what scholars sometimes call the classical prophetic period, a time when some of the greatest figures in the history of human spirituality were active. The prophet Isaiah was active in Judah in the 8th century BCE. The biblical book that bears his name is actually a collection of texts from different periods and possibly different authors, but it begins with oracles of the historical Isaiah, who was active in Jerusalem during the reigns of several kings of Judah. Isaiah's message was distinctive in several ways. First, he understood Yahweh not as a God among gods, but as the sole God of all creation, the God who ruled over all nations and all history. Second, he believed that Judah's special relationship with Yahweh did not exempt it from Yahweh's judgment. If Judah behaved unjustly, if its people oppressed the poor and marginalized, if its leaders were corrupt, then Yahweh would punish Judah as severely as he would punish any nation. Third, He believed that history was moving toward a day of ultimate judgment and restoration, when Yahweh would gather his people together, when justice would be established, when the world would be transformed. In the time of Isaiah, Judah was a small kingdom under Assyrian overlordship, paying tribute, subject to the power of a foreign empire. This was a humiliating situation for a nation that remembered the greatness of David, that saw itself as the heir to a promised land. Isaiah offered his people something that was perhaps more valuable than military power or economic prosperity. He offered a vision of meaning, a sense that Yahweh was working through history toward a purpose, that even in exile and humiliation, there was still purpose and hope. Isaiah also spoke of a future restoration, a day when the scattered people would be gathered together again. In that day, he said, "The root of Jesse will stand as a sign to the peoples, and to him shall the nations inquire, and his resting place shall be glorious." The root of Jesse refers back to Jesse, David's father. Isaiah was speaking of a future king who would come from David's line, a king who would restore the kingdom and establish justice in the world. This vision of a future deliverer, a Messiah or anointed one, would become central to Jewish hope in the centuries to come. When Judah faced disaster, this hope would sustain them. The belief that Yahweh had not abandoned them, that a future restoration was possible, that a king from David's line would come and establish justice, this was more powerful than any army. In the decades after Isaiah, other prophets arose with similar messages. Micah, another 8th century prophet, spoke of a future ruler who would come from Bethlehem, David's hometown, and would establish peace. Jeremiah, a later prophet active in the late 7th century, would speak of a new covenant that Yahweh would make with his people, written not on stone tablets but on human hearts. One notable king of Judah was Hezekiah, who ruled in the late 8th century BCE, and who had a more positive relationship with the prophetic tradition. Hezekiah attempted to reform Judah's religious practices, removing what he saw as idolatrous elements, centralizing worship in the temple in Jerusalem. He also attempted at one point to break free from Assyrian overlordship. When the Assyrian king Sennacherib marched on Jerusalem, Hezekiah refused to submit. Instead, he organized the city's defenses and called on Yahweh for deliverance. According to the biblical account, Yahweh answered. The Assyrian army, for reasons that are not entirely clear historically, possibly plague, possibly political problems elsewhere in the empire that called Sennacherib away, withdrew without capturing Jerusalem. The city was saved. For Judah, this was miraculous confirmation that Yahweh had not abandoned them, that he was still actively defending his people. But Hezekiah's independence did not last. Within a few years, Judah was again under Assyrian overlordship, again paying tribute, and by the time of Hezekiah's successor, Manasseh, Judah had fully returned to Assyrian vassalage. Manasseh even appears to have reversed his father's religious reforms, allowing the worship of foreign gods once again and persecuting those who advocated for exclusive worship of Yahweh. The 7th century BCE saw the slow decline of Assyria. The great empire that had dominated the eastern Mediterranean for over a century was weakening. Internal conflicts, the rise of rival powers, particularly the Babylonian Empire to the south, and the constant need to suppress rebellions throughout its vast territory finally overwhelmed Assyrian capacity to maintain control. By the early decades of the 7th century, Assyria's grip on the Levant was loosening. Judah, under Manasseh's grandson, a young king named Josiah, seized the opportunity to expand its territory and consolidate its independence. Josiah was one of Judah's great reforming kings, and he is remembered particularly for a program of religious reform and restoration. During Josiah's reign, while repairs were being made to the temple in Jerusalem, a scroll was discovered, what the biblical tradition calls the Book of the Law, and what scholars now generally identify as an early form of the biblical book of Deuteronomy. This scroll, which contained laws attributed to Moses and theology centered on exclusive worship of Yahweh, had an enormous impact on Josiah. He made it his mission to bring Judah's religious practice into conformity with this discovered law. Josiah's reforms were comprehensive. He removed idolatrous images and altars from the temple. He ended the worship of foreign gods. He centralized all legitimate worship in the temple in Jerusalem, closing local sanctuaries throughout the kingdom. He celebrated Passover on a scale not seen, the biblical account claims, since the time of the judges. It was a religious renewal, an attempt to return Judah to what its leaders understood as its proper relationship with Yahweh. Josiah's reign was also marked by military expansion. Free from Assyrian overlordship as Assyria declined, Josiah was able to extend Judah's borders to something approaching what they had been in earlier centuries. He may even have asserted some control over part of what had been the northern kingdom of Israel, though the extent of this expansion is unclear. But Josiah's independence and expansion did not last long. In the early years of the 6th century BCE, a new great power was rising, Babylon, and Egypt, seeking to maintain its own influence and prevent Babylonian dominance, moved militarily northward. In 609 BCE, Josiah, for reasons that are not entirely clear, attempted to oppose the Egyptian army. He was killed in battle at the city of Megiddo. Josiah's death marked the beginning of the end for independent Judah. His son succeeded him, but the kingdom was now caught between two great powers, Egypt and Babylon, each seeking to dominate the eastern Mediterranean. The next decades would see Judah attempting to navigate between these powers, sometimes submitting to one, sometimes trying to break free and align with the other. In 605 BCE, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II defeated an Egyptian army at the city of Carchemish on the Euphrates River. This battle established Babylon as the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean. The small kingdoms of the Levant, including Judah, understood that they now faced a new overlord. For several years, Judah paid tribute to Babylon and maintained a precarious independence. But in 597 BCE, King Jehoiakim of Judah, a young man in his late teens, made the decision to withhold tribute and attempt to break free from Babylonian control. Perhaps he believed that Babylon was overextended, that it could not maintain control of the distant Levant. Perhaps he simply did not have the patience for subservience. Whatever his reasoning, his decision brought catastrophe. Nebuchadnezzar marched westward with his army. The city of Jerusalem, capital of Judah, was surrounded and besieged. The siege lasted months. The inhabitants of the city, cut off from the outside world, gradually ran out of food. The situation became desperate. The biblical account describes people eating leather, grass, and even human flesh in the final stages of the siege. When the siege finally ended, in 597 BCE, the city was captured. King Jehoiakim was taken captive. The temple was plundered of its treasures, gold, silver, bronze objects of religious significance, all removed to Babylon. And the most important people in the kingdom, the royal family, the aristocracy, the priests, the skilled craftspeople, were deported to Babylon. The biblical account claims a number of about 10,000 was deported. Other sources suggest lower numbers. But however many it was, the effect was to remove the leadership class of Judean society and relocate it to the Babylonian capital. The kingdom of Judah was not entirely destroyed at this point. The land was not annexed into the Babylonian Empire. A governor was appointed to rule on behalf of Babylon, and the remaining population, primarily peasants and those without significant status, was allowed to remain. But the kingdom had been decapitated. Its king was a prisoner in a foreign land. Its elite had been carried into exile. Its independence was over. For a brief moment, it seemed as if Judah might recover. A man named Jehoiakim's uncle, named Zedekiah, was placed on the throne as a puppet king. For a few years, there was a kind of normalcy. The people remained. The land was worked. The temple, stripped of its treasures but still standing, was still a place of worship. But the situation was unstable, and the ambitions of those in power made it explosive. 10 years after the first siege, Zedekiah made the same mistake his predecessor had made. He attempted to break free from Babylonian control, probably encouraged by Egypt's promise of military support. Again, Nebuchadnezzar marched westward. Again, Jerusalem was besieged. This second siege, which lasted from 588 to 586 BCE, was even more terrible than the first. The hunger was worse. The conditions in the city were more desperate, and when the walls finally fell, Nebuchadnezzar's soldiers entered a city in agony. What happened next was catastrophic. The Temple of Yahweh, the great building that Solomon had constructed nearly 400 years earlier, the place that Jews had thought of as the center of their world, the dwelling place of Yahweh himself, was burned. The walls of the city were torn down. The population that had not been killed in the siege was rounded up and deported. This time, the deportation was more complete. Women and children, as well as men, the poor as well as the elite, all were driven out of the land. The countryside was left largely empty of its Jewish population. What remained was devastation. Destroyed cities, burned temples, fields that would not be worked, a land emptied of the people who had lived there for centuries. The destruction of Jerusalem and the temple represented the end of everything that Israel and Judah had been. The kingdom was gone. The temple was destroyed. The people were scattered. For Jews of this period, the experience must have been equivalent to the end of the world itself. The prophet Jeremiah was still alive during this period, and his response to the destruction was to compose a lament, a poem of mourning called Lamentations. How lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow has she become, she that was great among the nations. She that was a princess among the provinces has become a vassal. She weeps bitterly in the night, with tears on her cheeks. Among all her lovers she has none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. In Babylon, the deported population struggled to make sense of what had happened. How could Yahweh, the God who had promised to protect his people, have allowed this? How could the kingdom that David had established, that Solomon had made wealthy and magnificent, have been destroyed? Where was Yahweh's promise? Where was the covenant? This was the most profound crisis in the history of Israel and Judah. Not the political defeat. Empires rose and fell. Kingdoms were conquered and deported. Many peoples had experienced this. But the theological crisis was unique. Israel's faith was bound up with the land, with the temple, with the presence of Yahweh in their midst. To lose these was to lose everything that made them who they were. And yet, from this point of maximum despair, something remarkable happened. The exiled community in Babylon did not simply assimilate and disappear as the northern kingdom had done. Instead, it developed new forms of religious practice and new ways of understanding the faith. Without a temple, they gathered to study the law and to pray. Without a king from David's line, they looked forward to a future restoration, to a Messiah who would come. The Torah, the scrolls containing the law of Moses, became even more central to Jewish identity than it had been before. It was probably in this period, among the exiles in Babylon, that much of the material that would eventually become the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish scriptures, was compiled, edited, and given the form in which we know it today. The experience of exile became the lens through which past stories were understood and new stories were written. And among the exiles, prophets continued to speak. The latter part of the book of Isaiah, scholars call it Second Isaiah, seems to have been written during the exile or shortly after. This material is marked by a note of comfort and hope that is quite different from the earlier, more judgmental portions of Isaiah. Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem, and cry to her that her warfare is ended, that her iniquity is pardoned. These words were directed to the exiles in Babylon, telling them that their punishment was not permanent, that their God had not abandoned them, that restoration would come. Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill be made low. The uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain. And the glory of Yahweh shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. It is difficult for us, living in a world where instant communication connects us to virtually everyone and everything, to imagine what exile meant in the ancient world. To be taken far from your home, from the land of your ancestors, from the place where your gods were said to dwell, was to be cut off from the foundations of your identity. And yet the Jewish people in Babylonian exile developed a way of remaining Jewish, of maintaining their identity and their faith even in displacement. In 539 BCE, something extraordinary happened. The Persian Empire, centered in what is now Iran, defeated the Babylonian Empire. The new Persian king, Cyrus II, known as Cyrus the Great, came to the throne with a policy quite different from that of the Babylonian kings. The Babylonian Empire had been built on conquest and forcible integration. The Persian Empire was built on something different, on tolerating the religious and cultural practices of conquered peoples, on allowing displaced people to return to their homelands, on incorporating diverse peoples into a vast but flexible political system. One of Cyrus the Great's first acts was to issue a decree allowing the Jewish exiles to return to Judah and to rebuild their temple. This was not simply an act of altruism. Cyrus understood that allowing subject peoples to practice their own religions and maintain their own cultural institutions made them less likely to rebel. He also apparently had respect for the Jewish God and the Jewish people. The decree said, "Any of his people among you, let him go up to Jerusalem in Judah and rebuild the house of Yahweh, the God of Israel. And let each survivor in whatever place he sojourns be assisted by the people of his place with silver and gold, with goods and with beasts, besides the freewill offering for the house of God, which is in Jerusalem." After nearly 50 years in exile, the Jewish people were being offered the possibility of return. It must have seemed like a miracle to those who had lived their entire lives in captivity, and to the elderly who had been young when they were taken into exile. But the return was not as simple as it might have seemed. Those who had been exiled for half a century were no longer young. Their children had been born in Babylon, had grown up speaking Aramaic, had never seen the land of their ancestors. Not everyone wanted to return. Some had established lives in Babylon, businesses, property, families. The pull toward the old homeland was strong, but so was the weight of half a century of exile. Nevertheless, groups of exiles made the journey back. It was a long journey, roughly 1,000 miles from Babylon to Judah, probably taking several months. As they traveled, they carried with them the sacred vessels that the Babylonians had taken from the temple more than 50 years earlier. These objects had been treasured, preserved, waiting for the day when they could be returned to their proper place. When they arrived in Judah, they found a land that had been largely depopulated for 50 years. The cities were in ruins. The temple was a burned-out shell. But there were still people there. Jews who had never been taken into exile, who had remained and worked the land and maintained what religious and cultural life they could without a temple. And there were also other peoples who had settled in the land during the exile, or who had simply been living in the region. The returnees were faced with an enormous task: rebuilding the temple, re-establishing the religious and political institutions of their society, and reintegrating with those who had remained behind. It was difficult work, made more difficult by the fact that resources were limited and that the surrounding peoples did not always welcome the Jewish return. The rebuilding of the temple took several years. The foundation was laid, and when the foundation was complete, there was a ceremony. The people gathered to commemorate the laying of the foundation. The priests in their vestments sounded trumpets. The Levites, appointed to give praise, sang, and the people shouted with a great shout, so that the sound could be heard far away. But there were also tears. The biblical account notes that some of the older people, who had seen the original Temple of Solomon, or at least had grown up in the time when it stood, wept when they saw the foundation of the new temple. They remembered the glory of the first temple, and they understood that what was being built would not be as magnificent. The completed temple, what would be called the Second Temple, was finished in 515 BCE. It was smaller and less ornate than Solomon's temple had been, but it was sacred, a place where Yahweh was worshipped, a center around which the restored community could gather. The restoration of the temple was important, but equally important was the restoration of the community's relationship with its law and tradition. The Torah, the 5 books containing the law of Moses, became the constitutional foundation of the restored Jewish community. A priestly scribe named Ezra, either during the Persian period or in the early Hellenistic period that followed, is credited with bringing the Torah to the community, reading it aloud publicly, and establishing it as the binding law of the community. The reading of the Torah became a central act in Jewish religious life. In the rebuilt temple and in synagogues that developed alongside it, the law was studied and interpreted. The words of Moses were not simply historical document. They were the living word of God, containing wisdom for how to live, how to relate to God and to each other, how to maintain justice and righteousness. The return from exile transformed Judaism. No longer was it a kingdom with a king, a temple with a full array of sacrificial offerings, a religion tied to political power and territorial control. Instead, it became a religion of the book, a religion centered on interpretation of sacred text, a religion that could be practiced anywhere, even without a temple, even without a kingdom, even in exile. This transformation was not immediately complete. It took generations, but it is the reason that Judaism survived what other ancient religions did not. When the Second Temple would itself be destroyed 2 centuries later, Judaism would survive because the tradition had already shifted its center of gravity from temple and kingdom to text and interpretation. In the later Persian period and the early Hellenistic period that followed, Judah existed as a small autonomous community within a larger empire, recognized as having the right to govern its own internal affairs according to its own law, the Torah. It was not a kingdom in the old sense. The high priest in the temple was the chief officer of the community. But it was a community, a people bound together by law, by shared memory, by faith in Yahweh. The walls of Jerusalem were rebuilt. The temple stood in its midst. The people studied and interpreted the law. And though the kingdom of Israel and Judah, as political entities, had been destroyed, something enduring had been born from that destruction. A people who would carry their faith and their tradition wherever they went, who would survive the empires that rose and fell around them, whose sacred texts would become the foundation of 2 of the world's great religions. The land we traveled through is still there, changed by time but recognizable. The hills of Judea are still golden in the evening light. The Mediterranean still beats against the coast. Olive trees still grow where ancient olives grew. And in the hearts of millions of people across the world, the words and stories of ancient Israel still live and speak, still call us toward justice, still remind us that even in exile, even in despair, restoration is possible. Feel your breath moving gently in and out of your body. Feel the weight of your body settling deeper into whatever supports you. Your muscles are relaxed, your mind is calm. You have journeyed far, and now you are home, in this quiet place, in this moment. In your mind, still see that ancient land, but see it now in twilight. The day's heat is fading. The people are gathering, preparing evening meals. In homes and in temple courtyards, lamps are being lit. The world is settling into rest, as you are settling into rest. The stories you have heard tonight carry a truth that reaches across centuries. Kingdoms rise and fall. Prophets speak words that challenge and comfort. People face suffering and loss, but they also face the possibility of restoration, of return, of renewal. You carry within you the capacity for the same faith that sustained those ancient people, the faith that there is meaning even in difficulty, that justice matters, that community sustains us. Let go now of the names of kings and prophets. Let go of the way. If you're still awake, subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments, which empire should we explore next? Sweet dreams.